Good morning, good evening, good night, wherever you are or whatever time you're watching this. Just wanted to shoot this out. This is my first time using Screen-O-Matic, and I tell you what, it's really cool. I'm really thinking of all kinds of ideas with my kids, what I could do with this, but just bear with me if I have any mistakes. This is my fifth take, and I've decided I'm not going to stop and redo. So I want to begin. Really, you're getting the McDonald's view of, we'll call this Mick creativity. And what we're going to do is just kind of go really fast background. I can do a lot more of this in 2 weeks when we meet again, but and then really get to the point of what the assignment is, the actual lesson, the creative problem solving lesson. What I'd like to do though, just to give a real brief background, it'll be about a 5 or 10 minute one where creativity is right now in the research, or at least as Pioneer Reese sees it, and it was probably pretty accurate. And then kind of go back. We're actually going to go back in time to Torrnece and then to creative problem solving, which has been around since the 1950s, if I remember correctly. And it's not real new. It's just it's been changed and whatnot. So that's where we'll end, because that's where really the creative problem solving lesson comes in. So I want to start off. When you look at Vladimir Putin, we think. Just a second. Let me pause real fast. Vladimir Putin. When we think of Vladimir Putin, we oftentimes think of stoic, and he's done the Sochi Olympics. We saw him there, and he probably is that way. I think as far as from my chess club students' standpoint, though, he's always been sort of he plays chess, so we've always kind of followed him a little bit. And he has this big bravado image, and so one time we were kind of looking at it. Here's a guy who Putin is the only person that's probably killed two stones with one bird. He's probably when Putin doesn't do push-ups, the earth does earth downs. It's sort of one of those things where this is just a bravado man. He has a tiger as a pet. He can actually speak Braille. He's just an amazing. This guy really wants you to show you. He really puts his bravado out there, and he plays chess. So it was kind of striking to us one time when we noticed that he had painted his dainty picture and he was putting it up to auction. Some of the things that my kids brought up were really what I'm trying to get at. What was he looking at? What was this a picture actually of? And some people would say, well, some of the kids would say a childhood home. Some of them, oh yeah, this was Christmas at the Urals, and a cozy night at the lodge. And then some of the more sarcastic kids, 1 blue, 2 green, 4 brown. And of course, during this time, it was like 2008, 2009 when we did this. Watching troops amass along another former Russian republic. And then finally, the last one, when he was searching for Sarah Palin's house, I think they were referring to the idea that Palin had argued she could see Russia from her backyard. But the thing is, this creativity and cleverness in the research are sort of two different things. When we start looking at we're going to be looking mainly at creativity, the create part of creativity, and not so much the cleverness and almost like you could say artistic. But let's kind of go where we've been. We've looked at setting up a habits of mind environment. We've discussed differentiation and using learning style, interests, readiness. I think we're going to be working on multiple intelligences. Probably the next week or two, and then a little bit about higher order thinking, just mainly thinking of Bloom's taxonomy, the higher end of Bloom's taxonomy. We talked about complex and deeper thinking. The Curie Samara matrix is probably a good example of that. And so now we're at almost a different realm when we start talking about creativity. We also had discussed whole class, higher order thinking. Tiering. I'm tiering right now, actually. My students just happen to be planets, and planets work really. I need to have, I have some students that know a lot about planets, some students that don't even know what their order is. So I'm tiering right now, and that's what I'm doing. Then we independent study, learning contracts, and is also that most of you have turned those in, and I'm looking over them now. What we're going to get is creative problem solving. Creative problem solving. In creative problem solving, and we're going to start with, once again, Parnes. Parnes is this person here. He was around since the 1950s, and then we go Torrnece, and then we'll kind of end with Csikszentmihalyi, which is how I believe we can pronounce his name. who's been around, pretty much the leader right now in the field. And we'll talk about more along the lines of creativity. But the first thing is that we need to realize is the gurus are everywhere. Creative problem solving is not just something with education. It's in the business world. There's tons of people that have different models out there, and they pitch those. They're willing to come to your business and teach your people how to become more creative and do all these unique things. But let's kind of take a look at what it is from an education point of view, and exactly what is creativity. This is my PowerPoint that I was going to give, so there's a few things that don't really fit in here. But from Csikszentmihalyi's point of view, creativity is an act, idea, or product that changes an existing domain. What counts is whether the novelty he or she produces is accepted or for inclusion in the domain. What this is he is basically what they call a novel products of value person. He defines creativity as being, these can be new things that are built, but they have to have value. Let me make sure my daughter's not around here, but if you look at like a painting my daughter brings in, she's a 3-year-old, and you know it's kind of random, and so he would probably say, well, that's not creative. Although I would sit there and argue differently. It says it has to have value to the domain. This is really important, and I'm not just trying to wax philosophy here. In the sense that creativity is you have to have some purpose to it. It has to have something that's doing something. I have the Typhoon. It's a Kula class submarines. I spent a lot of my career in the Navy tracking those things. There's only like 7 or 8 of them in the late 80s, early 90s. But these things are massive, 600-foot long beasts. And the creativity that took the Russians to build these things, after now looking at it, and at the time I didn't know what they were, but was intense. They would literally go down in these submarines for 4 or 5 months at a time, and they wouldn't even really come back to port for 6 or 7 months. We would be following them around, and you had to wonder many times, how do those sailors put up with that? Well, you know, how could they live like that underwater for that long a time? And as it turns out, they had swimming pools in there. So these things had all kinds of stuff in there. So it took a lot of creativity, I think, to build one of these. And I believe there's 2 or 3 still around. They still make it in the news from time to time. But at this point, you know, what is creativity is something of value. Whoever built this, they had to put it together. They had to think through a problem. There were parameters in the way, and as they built this submarine back then. Ultimately, I'm just kind of skipping a lot of slides here, but for the most part, when we think of the 21st century skills, it has to be some kind of rarely it's really creative is developed with, you know, there has to be parameters there has to be time to think, and there has to be some reflection afterwards. That's really the theme that we're going to be getting into just the next few minutes. And let's move on. Just trying to get the first guy is going to be Csikszentmihalyi. He came up with the idea of flow and creativity, and he's a useful person to study. About 10 years ago, he took a turn and has drifted away from straight talk, the study of creativity and flow, to the study of basically the positive psychology. He's probably the second leading positive psychologist, and he links creativity to the good life, to being, to flourishing in life and whatnot. So that's kind of the direction he's going. But flow is essentially a timelessness, a feeling that you know, you may have been engaged in a book, so the story in a book so deeply that you actually don't remember turning the pages, you don't remember anything like that. It's just time has flown. Video games are a great example of flow, where time seems to fly. You don't even realize how much time is there. And so he studies flow, and he's come up with several books. I've got several of them here in front of me, but this is the one that was written in the 90s, late 90s, creativity, flow, and the discovery of invention. Gosh, that was a long time ago, I think. And then another one that is fairly famous for that we want to pay attention to, and why we're bringing him up, is he also wrote a lot about talented teenagers. And one of the research things he liked to do was study them when they were in these flow states. He actually had them carry pagers during his studies, and whenever he would page them, they were supposed to write down what they did and have their feeling of flow and whatnot. And so he got learned a lot about talented teenagers just by seeing what they were engaging in flow. That's one of his big claims to fame. But flow, for the most part, generally he's narrowed it down to three things that have to occur for flow to occur. Flow, once again, is sort of a deep, intense engagement in an activity, and usually it's a purposeful activity where something new is being built. When perceived high abilities are equal to the perceived high challenges, meaning somebody feels like they're up to the challenge, they're doing something, they're being challenged. A video game is great at doing this. A video game is usually, once you get a little bit better, it provides you a little more challenging of a scenario. So that's probably one of the reasons he would argue, well, that's why you get into flow, is you're constantly being challenged at that point. There are clear goals. So this is different, actually, than what was done before, where oftentimes creativity was thought of, well, just let anything go. But in this case, he found out that most of the time when these kids were in flow state, they had clear goals. They wanted to get better at something. They wanted to do something differently. They were building something that had a purpose. And then there needs to be immediate feedback. Once again, video games are great. If you do something right, you get some immediate feedback. But in many cases, they're being coached, or there's something that was giving them that feedback. So these are the three things, the three conditions. And when we start thinking about when we want to provide students an environment where creativity is expressed, generally that's kind of the three things that he would suggest that we try to work with with flow. Let me see if I can hit the button here. Oops, sorry about that. And then we'll move on to the next guy. I was going to show a video here of Csikszentmihalyi. I would urge you to kind of take a look at his work. Just, right now I'm skipping out of him real quick because he is an interesting fellow. He's got a couple of TED Talks, one from 2004 that has more of his creative work in it. He analyzed chess players. He analyzes all kinds of people, and he goes into the happiness thing a lot. But really, in 2011, he speaks a lot more about that. I think the funniest line he had is he just kind of mentions he was in Hawaii, his 40th anniversary, and he just runs into the president of the APA, American Psychological Association. So he spent the weekend talking with him. I'm sitting there going, I don't think my wife would like that, but I guess it was his 40th, so he didn't care. But anyway, let's move on. I'm going to go ahead and start with Torrnece. I have about 3 minutes, and I just want to give him a real quick look. E.P. Torrnece is actually a University of Georgia professor. He passed away recently, but he was hugely influential in creativity and education back in the 1960s and 1970s. His work is still used now, and many of you, I'm hoping in the second course, had heard about him as we still use his Torrnece test of creative thinking, the TTCT, to identify creativity, which is one of those four things that we need to identify with kids, or at least one of the criteria we use. He was the guy that came up with this idea, and he doesn't randomly do it. He did it he had purpose in what he was doing. He was actually my dissertation advisor. He was her dissertation advisor, and so they kind of had some influence on me, I guess, if through that. Let's go ahead and take a look at where he's going. He divided creativity into four different types of creativity: fluency, flexibility, originality, and elaboration. FIFO is something I use all the time in my work. Primarily, if you look at any of my rubrics, I think that I provided a rubric. There is an area where it says FIFO. My kids kind of understand what FIFO means. When I'm talking about creativity, they've had the speech where I'm telling them, just random stuff is not creativity. It's got to have some kind of structure to it. Fluency is the first one. Fluency is more along the lines of it's the ultimate divergent thinking, and this was in the age where divergent thinking was the whole thing, trying to come up with as many ideas as you could. Brainstorming, which is probably the next guy that we're going to talk about, was a big piece of this, just not in the education world, but teaching as well. Flexibility, flexible thinkers select ideas from a variety of categories and a lot of variety of perspectives. A good example might be Scamper, an activity called Scamper. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. Originality, this is probably what we oftentimes think of when we think of creativity. But originality not only just as in, we're talking about inventors, chefs, teachers, not just artists. Once again, trying to move away from that, coming up with a very new idea. And an elaboration. Elaboration is a skill in being able to take an existing idea and make it better. A good example would be, we used to see that the Japanese back in the 1980s oftentimes would create products that weren't original, but they were elaborations on what the Americans did. They just made it better. And so on the next part, we'll go ahead and how do we apply this in the classroom.